let's start now. So let me apologize for the delay, a few minutes, because of some technical issues. So let me welcome you at another lecture under the project that is called Nature Conservation Trends, which is implemented under the Norwegian funds, the Call Reine, raising public awareness in the field of improving the environment in ecosystems, that is supported by the State Environmental Fund of the Czech Republic. My name is Hošek. I'm one of the moderators under the project and also the inventors of the project. Before we will start, let me share with you a few organizational issues. The presentation is recorded, as you probably noticed already, because the record of the presentation will be posted on the YouTube channel later, on a YouTube channel of this project. So you can share the link later with your colleagues or friends. The presentation will last approximately about 1 hour. This is the agreement with our lecturer today. And please ask your question by two ways. One is that you will raise a hand, which is the tool that is on the bottom, one of the buttons there. Or you can write down the question to the chat, and we will ask that question at the end after the presentation during the discussion. And hopefully we will have about 20 minutes for the discussion. If there is any immediate question during the presentation, just raise the hand and we will give you a space, but please consider what is better if this question is really so important that it must be said during the presentation. So that's all for now, and let me start by the introduction of our today's expert, which is Andrej Sovinc, the Slovenian expert on protected areas. May I ask you for the next slide, Michal? So Andrej, welcome. Andrej was very long time a vice chair of World Protected Commission of World Protected Areas Commission under the IUCN, more than 10 years in Europe, and he has been working in many countries, not only within the EU but also outside of the EU. I can hopefully say that your specialty is the West Balkan countries, also because there is no language barrier for you. But today we invited you because we would like to ask you to share with us your vast experience about protected areas and their management, implementation, reporting, monitoring at the European scale. So Andrej, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michal. Good morning to everyone, dear friends and colleagues. I'm delighted to be here. Actually, it's not my first time to be with the Czech colleagues working on, especially on protected areas, but also on nature conservation. We had a similar presentation some years ago for your ministry. And I'm especially happy because the Czech Republic is used as a synonym for, especially for, let's say, for recognizing the long-lasting efforts, we can even say a system of protected areas. There are some very well-known protected areas at the European level. Let's say, I won't mention those by names. There are some that are known also in the European scale for some problematic issues, let's say about logging and bark beetle and also tourism. However, I think that the Czech protected areas are also well known by quite extensive system of protected landscapes, which was used several times as a model for other countries to be used in this category. I'm saying this because the IUCN, the World Commission on Protected Areas in Europe, has some around 700 members, And if we would ask those members how do they perceive the standards for management of protected areas, I don't say that we will get 700 different responses, but probably we'll get some 500 different responses. We have different views, the aim of my presentation today is more to show and to demonstrate some of the key issues that should be actually understood as the basic standards for understanding how the system of protected areas in one country should work. Michal, can we go on, please? Okay, so in my presentation today, I would like to, it will not be, a kind of a summary of what you can read in the guidelines, but it will provide a kind of comments on the key 5 steps that are important in the process of designing, establishment, and management of protected areas, including then a short note on assessment of the management effectiveness. And at the end, actually, I would like to ask you or to stimulate you to ask some questions, because I think that one of, or perhaps even the most important purpose of today's meeting should be the session about question and answers. So, as I said, I will start with how we establish protected areas, why do we establish them, and what are the needed background. I will emphasize the importance of a definition of a protected area, because IUCN links several of the principles that should be applied in every protected areas to the protected area definition, which means that these principles should be applied to every protected area, regardless of the category. Then I prepared a kind of Schnellkurs, or how to say, really the most important features that should be, let's say, applied when assigning the category, the protected area category, to a site. And then I'll just briefly, as I said, just briefly tell you how important it is that we report about protected areas in our country, and also about, as I said, just to show you what is currently probably the most advanced standard for assessment of the effectiveness of the protected areas. And at the end, as I said, some space for questions and answers. This sentence actually explains a lot, but not all. So protected areas are undoubtedly considered as the most important tool for conservation. In due time, one day, we all hope that protected areas won't be needed anymore. It won't be until our lives will still be there on the earth. But one day, hopefully, our society will go into sustainable mode, or if we don't go into the sustainable development, then there'll be no protected areas, but there'll be also no world for us. But until then, it's really important that we have protected areas, the network, which is comprehensive enough, which is well connected, which is especially well managed, put in the right places, and which is supported by decision makers, but also by the general public. So next slide, please. It's now time that we are actually celebrating. We are celebrating the achievement. We almost achieved the targets that were set by the Convention of the Biological Diversity, the so-called Aichi target, on protected areas. The target said that by the year 2020 we should have 17% of the land and 10% of the oceans under some kind of protection. And we are reaching, if we would be able to include all protected areas that are not currently in the world database on protected areas, for example, some protected areas in Turkey, for whom we know that they exist, but they're not in a world database, so they cannot count into this 17% of land in protected areas. We reached this 17% somehow on land. We almost reached the marine target, and now we are now in times when we are setting up the new conservation agenda. We call it the post-2020 agenda, and this brings a shift in the current understanding of what areas should be included in this kind of the numerical targets for protection, or just better to say, of well-managed areas for biodiversity conservation. So the new conservation agenda is actually composed by 3 components. The one are the nationally protected areas, the one that we know, so national parks, nature reserves, strict nature reserves, protected landscapes, and so on, plus conserved areas or ecological networks. Europe is the leading continent on this kind of networks. We know that we have the Natura 2000 network in the EU countries, and its equivalent in non-EU countries, the Emerald network. And the third and the new component, which is called OSCM, or other effective area-based conservation measures, which are not protected areas, but they are an important component of biodiversity conservation, because management of these areas is directed in a way that it also provides benefits for the biodiversity conservation. Where we are at present, as we said, we have 17% of land, we have 8% of marine, we have only 1% of land in the OSCMs and 0.1 in the OSCMs. Here, of course, we should know that the OSCMs are a very, very new category. It's only some 3-4 years old, and that the system is still establishing. So for the future, as I said, we'll have 3 components, and there will be no, the negotiations are still going on how much land and oceans should be protected. But well, it is around 30%. It's still not officially confirmed, and negotiations are still going on. However, please note that not only that we are not talking in these 30%, we are expanding from protected areas to also to ecological networks and to OSCMs. And the second major difference is that the world will certainly not follow the European Union, I would say, the new paradigm, which says that not only the percentage of protection is valid, but that we need also strict protection inside our protected areas. And the current target, as set in the EU Biodiversity Strategy until 2030, says that there should be 10% of European Union under the strict protection. Next slide, please, Michal. Yeah, so we are celebrating protected area targets, and we certainly should be proud of that. Because actually, you should know that this year we are celebrating 150 years of the first national park established in Yellowstone. And then the curve, the growth of protected areas was not really speeding up at full force until the last couple of decades. Then some things changed, especially, I would say the key point was that people started to get aware that we are destroying our nature too fast. And since 1970s or 80s, we are expanding our network of protected areas. So if this is so, why do we have this, the Global Living Planet Index, so the WWF effort to measure the loss of biodiversity? And if we look at that index, which is now the latest one, it's presented here. You probably know about this index. It was established in 1970, where they collected the trends and the population status of some 3,500 species around the globe and subspecies. And the status of those species was indicated as number 1. And now they are following, they're monitoring what is happening with those species. And here is the result. And the result is really, really, really dramatic. So we lost 68% of those species. I mean, their populations and the trends are declining, which means that in the period of 50 years, which is a tiny drop of time in the history of our planet. So in 50 years, we managed to destroy more than 2/3 of the former biodiversity values. So it's really, I think that if we are able to communicate this diagram, that everybody should get really worried that something is badly wrong. But at the same time, I said that the curve of the extent of protected areas is totally opposite. In the year 1917, it was, let's say, almost 0. And now we have this 17% of inland and almost 10% or 9% of the oceans under protection. So what is wrong? Why biodiversity is still declining? For 2 reasons. The first one is that, of course, not all biodiversity is placed inside the protected areas. We said we have only 17% of the globe, of the land in protected areas. So for sure, biodiversity, it's located outside protected areas. And we need to do something. We need to do something to make our life and our world much more sustainable in our everyday life outside protected areas. However, this is not the topic of my presentation. It should be a separate topic, very, let's say, complicated and comprehensive. I'm talking about the other part. So we are witnessing a major growth of protected areas, but biodiversity is declining. And some recent studies, very recent one, a new one in February, actually indicated that in some areas in the world, biodiversity is declining much faster inside protected areas than outside. So what is then the problem? The problem is, okay, they're not placed, the protected areas are not placed in the right places. They're not big enough, they're not interconnected, they're not well supported. But the key problem, and this is my first key message to the European audience, is that our protected areas are not well managed. We have not only paper parks, but we have parks that are actually established because of some other reasons and they're not delivering the goals of conservation. And I think that our efforts, especially in the European Union in the future, should go in parallel, or if not even more concentrated, on improving the management of existing protected areas rather than expanding to other areas. I'm not saying that we don't need more areas, of course not. I'm just saying that our efforts should be equally important to improve the management of the existing protected areas. And this is a huge, huge task, especially because in our minds, it's very complicated. It's very difficult to persuade people that we need to do something differently if we already have some protected areas. And that's why my presentation today is orientated to indicate what are those standards. Next slide, please, Michal. Okay, so how does the life of a protected area look? So first, we have to make a decision that we want to establish a protected area somewhere. Usually, we use the national strategy, national biodiversity strategy, national legislation, national environmental programs, and so on, and inventories of important areas. Here, I'm focusing more, and I'll share a couple of words and thoughts later, on the new EU Biodiversity Strategy 2030. Because in the European Union, we all know that European Union law is actually suppressing, it's higher than the national law. So we have to respect or to do everything to fulfill the European, let's say, strategies and legislation. And I'm pleased, and I'm working in protected areas since the early 1990s, so 30 years. And I've never seen in my life, I never experienced so well, let's say, established strategy for dealing with the protection of the territories, like it is the EU Biodiversity Strategy. Then we will say a couple of words about the IUCN protected area definition. Why that? Because, as I said, IUCN sets a couple of principles that are not mentioned for every particular protected area category, because they should be applied to every protected area. And this component is often, very often neglected or overlooked when thinking about protected areas, a certain category and so on. Then we will go to the most sexy thing in protected area life circle, and this is the assignment of the category. Is this a national park? Is this a landscape, protected landscape? Should just be perhaps a nature reserve? Can we talk about the wilderness areas in Europe? What are the strict protected areas, especially in the European Union context, and so on? And then at the end, we will not have time because this would again require probably another set of talks like this. we will just briefly mention the importance of reporting the data on protected areas to the World Database on Protected Areas. Of course, to report the proper information. And then we will I'd just like to highlight or to focus your attention on the recent assessment tool, or better to say, the recent standards on management effectiveness of protected areas, which is called the Green List. Next slide, Michal, please. Okay, we are now about to establish a protected area. So next slide, please. I would like to say a couple of words about the, let's say, the international stimulus for establishment, but also for management of protected areas, conserved areas, so ecological networks, and also OSCMs at the European Union level. Because the Czech Republic and also other countries, they have their own legislation. I would just like to highlight the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and then to relate it to the national policies on protected areas. So we have this standard now in the EU Biodiversity Strategy saying there should be 30% of land and 30% of the oceans within the European Union under some form of protection, and 1/3 of those protected areas on land and 1/3 on the oceans should be strictly protected. In addition to that, the strategy is very, I would say, advanced, because it is setting up also targets for restoration. So not only management of what is still valuable, but the strategy recognized that now it's time, the time has started to restore some of the degraded areas. By restoration, I understand also that we need to have a better management of existing areas. There are, you know, that there are some very concrete, let's say, requirements in the strategy, like 20,000 kilometers of the rivers should be put back into the natural, or at least semi-natural state, and so on. So Europe is taking the lead for sure at the global level, and the tasks are huge. I have no fear for the inland areas, because in the European Union, if we combine the network of the nationally protected areas, so the national parks and reserves and protected landscapes and so on, with the existing network of Natura 2000 sites, and also, let's say, the mirroring the emerald sites, we are almost at some 26-27% of European Union territory, which is already protected. So we are very close to this target, the 30% of inland areas to be protected. We will easily, I mean, easily in brackets, but we will get this 3% more for sure. The task, it's much more complicated on the oceans. This is not perhaps so interesting for the Czech Republic, but let me just tell you that the target will now be to increase protection from 8% to 30% at sea, which is really a difficult task. And we are the most challenging things for European Union regarding this category. I think it's the meeting the targets of the 10% of the strictly protected areas. This will be much more, let's say, demanding task. And I think it will be very, very difficult to reach this task without allowing some changes in the definition of the strict protection. And I'll talk about this a little later. So next slide, please. So as I said here, we have in this 30% that we need to achieve of protection, we have this new category also to add. So OSCM, other effective area-based conservation measures, which are not protected areas, but they can contribute. So in a way, they're, let's say, in some countries, let's say in the country where I live, so Slovenia and also Croatia, and perhaps even further to the east, there is a so-called the old forestry school, which is unfortunately now decaying under the huge pressures of the big money. However, that school managed to retain the ecological character of the forests in these countries. So no clear cuts, maintenance of the forest, reduced cutting of trees, obligation to leave some dead trees in dead wood in the forest and so on. Actually, some of these areas, some of the forests in our countries could easily qualify as the OSCMs. So for me, as I said, this is not a real big challenge. The challenge comes at sea. Just for your information, there is less than 3% of the sea in the Adriatic. We all know Adriatic because we spend our holidays there. Less than 3% of the sea is under any form of the Adriatic Sea, under any form of protection, including Natura 2000 and nationally protected areas, which is really, really, really a problem. Okay, so I said that I will spare a couple of words about the strict protection inside European landscapes. Strict protection is usually perceived as the no-take and no-go zone. However, we should know that the most degraded and the most endangered habitats or even ecosystems in Europe are secondary ecosystems, so the grasslands. And these grasslands, per definition, per basic understanding, they need intervention because they developed throughout the development of the European civilization with the presence of man. So the problem is that maintaining those grasslands until very recently, until the last, let's say 20 or 30 years, when these big plastic bags started to not only to emerge, but to spread around European grasslands, the situation was somehow under control. But now we changed this technology, the approach of mowing and the system of pastures so rapidly that the time which was left to biodiversity, and here I show the picture of one species, the bird species, the windchat, Saxicula rubetra, which is suffering so dramatically because of these changes, and it's a good indicator of these dramatic changes. So simply the time was too short in the evolutionary scale that the species could adapt to these changes. So we will probably have to think of another understanding and broader the definition of the strict protection on the secondary habitats and ecosystems, the grasslands. And one of the possible solutions probably could go into direction that in our protected landscapes and our farmland, that we will have to establish strict reserves where no uses of grasslands for agriculture will be allowed, but only management of these grasslands for biodiversity conservation, which means mowing once per year at the end of the vegetation and reproduction season. So this is a challenge. The debate is still going on in the European Commission, and I would like to invite you all, because you're experts on biodiversity, to support or to take part in this kind of discussions, so that we can actually change and influence our thinking on strict protected areas or strict protection in the secondary habitats. Of course, strict protection in the forest means no take and sometimes even no go zone. But for grasslands, which are actually the most endangered and also quite widespread ecosystems in the European Union and also in Europe, in highly populated Europe, we should look at this a little differently. Next slide, please. Yeah, we did some mistakes in the past. And it's very difficult to amend this kind of mistakes. So we established our protected areas in places where we already had some devastating activities, which at that time perhaps were not regarded as devastating, but today, when the extent of the untouched nature is actually shrinking, we realize that this is not compatible with nature conservation. So I'm showing here an example of a national park. I don't want to say which national park, because I don't want to blame anybody. But actually, there is it's a fantastic area somewhere in the Balkans. But there is a big ski resort that was there already by the time when this national park was established. So what now? We have this kind of infrastructure in our national parks. I know you have it also in the Czech Republic. You are well aware about these similar things in the Slovak Republic, in Bulgaria, in Spain, and in others. So what to do now? Because it's almost impossible to persuade the decision makers, but also the general public, that this doesn't work. I mean, doesn't work for biodiversity conservation. Of course, it's probably not the intention that we will get rid of this kind of wrong developments. However, we should not allow that those developments are spreading, which in turn comes as a boomerang, because the managers of those resorts are then saying, we are not getting enough money and we are not commercially viable anymore if we are not expanding, which is in a way also true. So this all brings us to a common conclusion again, that without sufficient support of the state, of the governments who are responsible for protection of nature and biodiversity at the state level, that they should help us here. They are giving subsidies for, we call them perverse subsidies, in agriculture, in tourism, in let's say in infrastructure development. They're building airports in the areas where those airports will never be profitable and so on. It's not a problem to find money. It's always a problem to find money for supporting the biodiversity conservation in cases like this. Next slide, please. Now we go to the definition of the protected areas. Next slide. You are probably aware about this definition. I don't want to go into details. I'd just like to say a couple of things. That the protected area has to be defined both on paper but also in nature. That every protected area has to be managed, even if management means no management. So no take, no go, but this is also management. That has to be established by a legal or any other agreement. And the protected area, once it is established, it should be forever. It is not just a short term. It should not be changed when the new, development idea comes on the agenda. So this should stay forever. And of course, we are recognizing more and more the importance of protected areas in the provision of the ecosystem services and also connection between nature and culture in these areas. Next slide. Why I'm saying that the definition of a protected area is so important? Because, as I said, there are some principles that apply to every protected areas. I summarized just 4 of those principles. I think that they are the most important one, and I'd like to share them with you. So IUCN says that every exploitation or use of natural resources that is proved to be harmful to the objective of a protected area should be prevented or eliminated. So if somebody asks me now if there is a national park in the Czech Republic and inside the national park the foresters would like to do some commercial logging, I think I would just say, please read this principle, which should apply to every protected area. And obviously there is a protected area, so this is a strict, let's say, confrontation, and the state again should find a solution here to satisfy some of the principles that should apply to every protected areas, because we live in a kind of civilized community where we also respect the international law and legislation. So about every protected area should maintain or even increase the level of natural state of this area. If I say so, and if I go back to the ski resort that I was showing at the last in the previous slide, so isn't this enough to explain that that every ski resort is minimizing the level of naturalness of that area, and that it's against the international standard? The 75% rule, this is very, very important and often misunderstood. The primary management objective for every protected area, according to the international IUCN standards that are also adopted by the CBD, say that in 75% of this area, this primary management objective should be, let's say, applied, and that in 25% also other activities, other objectives could easily be fulfilled. So if we are designing or managing a protected area, we still have 25% of the area where we can do also other things. But please let us let us realize that we want to have 75% of each of a protected area managed according to the primary management objective. And if the primary management objective says that we want to protect the natural biodiversity and the original ecological processes, including erosion and natural succession and so on. So I think that this should solve several of the problems that or misunderstandings about the management of these protected areas. And all protected areas are important. We don't need to have only national parks. We don't need to only to have strict protected areas. We also need protected landscapes and also other categories. However, please don't misuse this, because we need to deliver. Then, even in our protected landscapes, we need to deliver the management objectives. So, well-managed protected area in each category is equally important to the global conservation. Next slide, please. So the categories. What category to assign? So let's go to the next slide. There are 5 considerations when we talk about a protected area category. Is this, we are talking about the ecosystem, the habitat, or the natural feature? Is this a big or a small area? Is this fully natural or human modified area? Do we have native species and habitats? So what is the biodiversity value? Or do we have more species and habitats that are adapted to the human cohabitation? And at the end, who or what are the guiding forces? Are there natural processes or man-modified processes that are governing our protected area? Next slide, please. We will probably, we won't have time to go through every of those 6 IUCN categories, actually 7, because category 1 is split into 2. So I will not, you will have a chance, you will get this presentation, and I put it deliberately in the form of a bullet point on the next slide. Let me just briefly go through the key points. So for the category 1A, these are usually smaller areas, but fully natural and without any human habitation or visitation. So 75% of this area should be no-take and no-go zone. There are very few of such areas, especially in Europe, and perhaps we will have to think how to broaden this definition, or how to make it applicable to the specific European circumstances. Then we have the wilderness areas, which are big areas and fully or in the high percentage of natural areas, where it is important that not only that the nature is in fully natural state, but we want to promote the feeling of wilderness, of solitude, of appreciation of nature without any disturbance. Disturbance means visual disturbance, that I'm not looking from the mountain and then that I see a big motorway or hear the noise from the industry and so on. So the area should be big. And these are also actually no-take and no-go zones with major exceptions. So self-sustaining use for those few people who live in these areas or who visit these areas is allowed. So for self-sustaining uses, and visitation of these areas is strictly limited, and it is not supported by any infrastructure. So if you go to a wilderness area and you walk along the river, don't expect that somebody will build a bridge to cross the river, you can do it the way like animals do it. So you can swim, or you can try to walk, or you can turn around and go to another area. So it would be wrong to think that in these areas that we will build infrastructure for let's say visitation. And then we have this national park. The key understanding of the national park, as I said, is we need to support the natural biodiversity, so the whole variety, and including, and this is very often neglected, all the natural processes that support this biodiversity. And natural processes, to make them fully, let's say, operational, if it requires some space. So national parks cannot be small areas. If we want to, if there is a landslide or a snow slide, this is a natural process, so we have to allow it. The problem with our national parks, of course, is what I mentioned before. We established those areas a long time ago. We allowed some, or perhaps in often cases, too many human settlements or human uses are already there. And of course, this all causes problems now in reaching the standards of the national park management. Next slide, please. I will skip those slides on primary objectives, but you have a very clear explanations here. So perhaps make a stop here just for a national park, just briefly. I did this table for the purpose of this this presentation. So on the first column, you have the key uses of natural resources in national parks, and you have in the main column you have what is actually allowed or not allowed in the 75% zone. Of course, you have to adapt, but you will see what are the guidelines, and you have an explanation what could be done in the 25% zone of a national park. So, for example, if we are talking about, I don't know, recreation, yes. Passive recreation, yes. No, if we want to build new major infrastructure like the ski resorts that I mentioned already, or similar things. And what is also important, no mass events. So under mass events means also, let's say, organization of the big sport events. Sport events are not really a big contribution to the appreciation of nature. It's more for our own, let's say, health or even competition purposes. Please read this if you're interested, because we don't have time for this. It's just prepared for you to look at this later. Let's go then to the next slide. I wanted to stimulate a discussion, questions and answers later, and I'm hoping that you will ask me a question about what about grazing in the national park, which is category 2 national park. So I just put it as an example of questions for the discussion. Next slide, please. There are 2 categories that are not so complicated, mainly because in many cases there is not a strict competition between other land uses, because these areas are often small. So mainly the nature reserves, like some waterfalls or some caves or some cliffs or so, where we don't have clashes with agriculture or forestry. And the category 4, which often suits very well to the definition or to the understanding of the Natura 2000 sites, but there are also areas which require specific human activities or measures to support certain species or certain habitats. So this is the next slide, please. Then we have the larger areas, which are man-made, or at least partly man-made and sustainably used ecosystems, but where the primary conservation function is prevailing. So this is the commonly known, the protected landscape, and the category 6 is called the sustainable use of natural resources. Next slide, please. I will just say something about the protected landscape and the misunderstanding that is very often, let's say, put forward. The key objective is landscape and biodiversity conservation in these areas, not the production function. So if a landscape is to become a protected landscape, then actually it should work to support biodiversity and not vice versa. It's very often, I just came back from one of the Balkan countries where they established now a protected landscape in an area where you have the biggest industrial sites, the biggest industry, two very big, not only towns, but towns with some 20,000 people inside the area, where you have the spatial plan, which allows for building actually individual houses all across the area, and the protection regime has 3 zones, in which the zone 1, the most strictly protection zone, is spread around 0.1 square kilometer. The zone 2, which is somehow limiting some of the land uses, urbanization, is extended around some 10%, and 90% is the zone 3, where everything is allowed. So it's completely against any proper understanding of a protected landscape. And the important thing is what I briefly mentioned before, or referred before. So the problem is that in protected landscapes, we want, or we need to maintain the long-lasting interaction between man and nature. So the things that brought us to the situation of today, where we still have rich biodiversity in one landscape, this should be maintained. It does not mean that mowing of the grassland should be done by hand. I'm not saying that, but it means that probably the new technique and practices using these plastic bags for which implies mowing of the grasslands almost a month earlier than 500 years, in the last 500 years, that this kind of practices, of course, should not be allowed in the protected landscape. Next slide, please. Okay, here you have the explanation of what I was just saying. So you can see some of the points to your consideration about recreation, tourism, and so on. The next slide is the last category. Before that, I'm asking a question. After telling you now about the protected landscape, my question here, this is a protected landscape. So my question to you is there any particular value of so dramatically used area? So there's actually almost no natural area in what you can see, except the very intensive vineyards, very intensive agriculture without any solitary trees or just a few bushes. But all in all, it's really intensively used landscape for agriculture. So this, of course, is not an example of a protected landscape. Unfortunately, we are facing views and pictures like this quite often in our European home. Next slide, please. So the last category is category 6, where we are protecting natural ecosystem by using 1/3 of this area, let's say, for some kind of sustainable use, which also promotes biodiversity. So I'm often, when explaining this category, I'm often telling people, look at the Amazonian tropical forest and the primitive people who live there. So they're using some part of this forest for their own purposes, but not, of course, for the extractive industry like the white people, or the Western civilization is doing there. This is not really very relevant category for Europe, so perhaps we should go on. I will now briefly, I'm looking at my time. Yeah, I think it's time. So just briefly about the reporting. Next slide, please. So it's also an obligation of a country that reports about the categories and extent and location and the governance system on their protected areas to a world database on protected areas, which is managed by the World Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge, which is an UNDP organization. You can find the database in a kind of a commercial or user-friendly database on protected areas at the global level, but also at the country level. So also for the Czech Republic, for example, if you browse the protectedplanet.com website. So every country has a national point. Usually this is a person or the unit at the ministry responsible for protected areas, which sends the data on their protected areas to the WCMC. As I said, this is a part of the UNEP program. And there they do a kind of an internal evaluation of the data and then put it in the database. However, before that, there is also a kind of a process of consultation. So if there are some unclear things, also NGOs or scientific organizations could provide some comments if they disagree on the, let's say, the category status of some of the protected areas that are listed in the Protected Planet or the World Database on Protected Areas database. So, so this is a kind of a consultation. It's not really formal. It's more on voluntary basis, but I would like to invite you to look at the database and to report to the WCMC if you think that there are some not really correct information about your the Czech protected areas in the database. And at the end, as I said, the data has to be in one unique database in order that we can compare, that we know how much of our planet is actually well protected or properly protected to achieve the, let's say, the global target of protection of the biodiversity. So this is just for you to, let's say, the further reading or the further actions if you're interested about protected areas. And the next slide, it's the management effectiveness. I said at the beginning, and I will also conclude by that, for me, and I'm not the only one, we believe that now the question of improving management of existing protected areas is at least as important as setting up new protected areas. And here it is really a big task for all of us. The task is especially difficult because we'll have to change the long-lasting and often wrongly perceived standpoints about or understanding of our protected areas. The Europark Federation, already in the mid-90s, they published a publication about protected areas and the tourism, and they said the title was "Loving Them to Death." And this is the best expression that I heard about protected areas, especially our national parks. We love these areas, but we love them to actually just to use them for our own purposes, for tourism, even for logging, for agriculture, for any wrong reasons that should be avoided. So we need to really to change this, and the most important steps here are first that we understand the standards. What are the standards for protected area management, and then that we start promoting these standards and raising awareness of our decision makers, but also the general public, seeking support for better and more effective management of these areas. So if you can go to the next slide, I'd like to highlight your attention on the IUCN Green List standard, which is the most comprehensive recent global standard on, let's say, on understanding on how well your protected area is managed. It is composed by 3 components. So the first is the effective management, let's say, per se. It evaluates also the governance. So who is taking the decisions, who is responsible, how stakeholders are engaged or involved in these management processes. And it checks how the areas are designed and planned. So they're looking also at the more, let's say, planning components and spatial components of these areas. We don't have time, and it was not a purpose to explain further the green list, but I wanted to just to show you what is actually the new or the recent, let's say, the global tool for or the global standards for well-managed protected areas. The next slide, please. So this was what I wanted to say to you. It was just 1 hour as what we agreed, and I'm more than pleased if there will be some interest. I would try to respond to if there are some questions. I'd like to ask the moderators, Michael, or I don't know who is taking the moderation now. If there are some questions, I'll try to respond in my opinion or in my way.
Thank you, Andrej. Thank you for a comprehensive presentation. I would like to ask Michal to switch off the sharing mode. So, Andrej, thank you very much for all the information that you shared with us. There are few questions in the chat, but first of all, let me tell that I will have to leave you in 7 minutes, but Michal will continue with moderating the discussion between you and the audience. Before we will start with questions, let me just add that definitely speaking on behalf of the Europark Federation, as you mentioned, the management effectiveness is the priority for us now. And this is connected to the biodiversity, the EU Biodiversity Strategy, because this is the first strategy in the history of the EU in which we have not only Natura 2000 network, but also nationally designated areas as those that should compose together a coherent European network of protected areas. But definitely the problem is that there is a lot of paper parks, or if not a paper parks, those that are managed in an irregular way or not monitored about the trends inside of protected areas really well. So this is the issue for us, not only the Europark, but also the European Commission. So now I will start with questions, and then Michal will continue later. The first question was about district protection, because you mentioned that district protection should be somehow interpreted in a way that will allow also some conservation measures in those areas that are just for the purpose of conservation measures. But the question is, if you open the chat, you will see that it is the question by Anežka Koupkova. Good morning. I might have missed the information, but how are you planning on getting the 1/3 of 30% of grasslands in the EU under the strict protection? I think this is a misinterpretation because you didn't talk about taking 1/3 of grasslands into the strict protection. You talked about grasslands as one example of habitats that require some regular management. Is it so?
Yeah, yes, you're right. Thank you, Anežka, for your question. No, I'm not talking about the 1/3 of the 30% of the grasslands. I'm talking about the protected areas, already established protected areas that contain grasslands, and that probably we'll have to consider how to achieve appropriate management of these grasslands for biodiversity. The practices that are in place so far proved not to be effective. If that would be the case, then we wouldn't be losing the grassland biodiversity so rapidly. So there are more and more thoughts, but also, let's say, positions that are supported by scientific research, that actually the modern practices on grasslands are simply too, if I say aggressive, I don't want to use this word, but they are too, they are not really compatible with the delivery of the conservation targets. And one of the options how to tackle this would be to establish a stricter areas inside grassland areas where conservation would be not for commercial purposes, the management not for commercial purposes, which could be beneficial for biodiversity, but the opposite, management for conservation primarily. Your question is, does this imply the buying of the properties? Actually, no. In some cases, that would be excellent. In some countries, it works, but these are countries in the north of Europe. For example, in Sweden, you cannot establish a national park unless the country buys the land before. It's not realistic to expect this to be done in our part of Europe, but there are, and I'm sure that you know, that there are some measures that countries are obliged to implement to reach the favorable conservation status of the Natura 2000 species and habitats. And countries have to set up also, I mean, they're not obliged to do so, but actually cannot do without that, a kind of a system of subsidies or tax reductions or any other benefits that could be offered to the owners of the grasslands to, let's say, to set their grasslands aside for conservation. It's a huge task. I'm pretty much aware. It will be a kind of revolutionary thinking, but probably I don't see another option except that.
Thank you, Andrej. The next question is somehow linked also to that. This is from Jarmila Jandova. Speaking about grasslands, can EU agriculture policy and agriculture subsidies be beneficial also for nature protection? Do you have any example of a country where subsidies meet goals of nature protection?
At some extent, they can. The new agriculture policy is definitely allowing enough space and enough efforts to provide better protection of the grasslands in the agricultural landscapes. And for some species and some habitats, it works. Look at some species need very, very limited, let's say, reduction of the land uses to be successful. Some bird species, for example, when they started with setting up the Natura 2000 network, they benefited a lot because they don't need much. The problem is with more specialistic species, those who are really specialist species. This is much more of a problem. I mentioned, for example, the winchat, that bird. I think it's the only species that I put on my presentation because I didn't want to go into details. But for example, for that species, it is almost impossible to find a balance between today's management of the grassland, which is commercially viable, and the needed success of the breeding of this species. You should know one thing: the young birds of this species need 2 weeks after they leave the nest to fly away when the predation is coming, whether the predation is a fox or a rotational mower. So the problem is that actually these birds are cut by the modern technology, and simply they nest in the ground, and they cannot adapt fast enough to these new approaches and techniques. They will before they will get extinct, so, or at least locally extinct. So if we want to do this kind of a comprehensive, I think that both approaches will be needed. So a kind of reduced intensification of the use, but also setting aside some areas for those more demanding components of the biodiversity.
Okay, thank you, Andrej, for the answer. And here is another question in the chat. It's from Martina Uradnikova, and the question is concerning increasing protected areas. Are there any schemes or mechanisms to refund land owners who decide to give their property for the purpose of protection? And the question is on the EU level, not really on the national level.
Actually, this is little controversial. The European Commission based their approach more on the national efforts, so that there should be a kind of a national strategies, payments for biodiversity and so on. However, there are European Union funding mechanisms where countries or areas or even landowners, if they're connected into a kind of a project, could apply for funding to support their activities. Let's say reduction of the intensity of the grazing or land uses. So, in principle, there is no European Union overall mechanism saying ask for money and you will get euros to transmit to the farmers who should do it. No, something like this does not exist, but there are mechanisms both at the national but also at the EU level where you can indirectly get some funding for this, for let's say biodiversity friendly agriculture.
Okay, thank you. There is no other question in the chat, so I'll ask the audience if there is any other question So this is the time to ask. If there is not any other question from the audience, then let's go back to one of your slides about the grazing in the national parks. So what intensity, what area it is to be grazed in natural parks, and is it feasible? Is it okay for protection?
Yeah, thank you for reminding us to the question that I actually set out to stimulate the discussion, because I know that in the past that was also a question which was of high relevance for the Czech and the Slovak partners in protected areas. So first of all, there are several things that we need to consider. The easiest thing would be, and we will have no problems, let's say, in reaching the international standards, let's say, for a national park, that we simply do the zoning of the national park in a way that 25% zoning comprises also the alpine meadows for grazing. So you put zoning in a way that those meadows are in that zone, in the 25% zone where mowing is allowed. You only set up some restrictions so that, of course, that the intensity, so let's say in principle should be no more than, let's say, 7 animals per hectare, grazing animals, cows per hectare. And this is totally okay with the IUCN standards. But sometimes this is not enough, because it could be that in some alpine areas which are part of the national park, that the grazing areas are exceeding 25%. So then the question remains what to do with these areas to somehow to satisfy the international standards. And one of the solutions could be that, of course, we start at the beginning, so very long time ago. I'm talking about several hundred years ago, when this grazing started to appear. And in this long time period, several species managed to adapt to that. Even more, they become dependent on this kind of non-aggressive, easily to say, sustainable and let's say comparable land use. So if we are looking from that perspective, it could easily be explained that we need also these areas, and they can even fit then into the 75%, at least part of them, into the 75% of the primary management objective, so that we explain that actually this is a kind of a natural biodiversity which developed in the very long time period. And that the only thing that we need to secure is that the grazing regime remains the same as it was, so that there are no major changes, no new technologies, so that the cows are not maintained, that the farmers are coming, I don't know, by new roads, with the tractors and with all the modern technology and expanding the number of grazing animals and so on. So in this sense, IUCN somehow understands that this is fully compatible. So nobody will say that you need to abandon deliberately this kind of grazing, but you have to keep it in the form that it was already developed some long time ago. and then you can easily specify that part of this could easily go under the primary management objective of preservation of the biodiversity, and that you can even, because it's such a long time process, you can even consider this as a kind of almost a natural process. Natural ecological process is kind of a grazing which is not intensive.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So it assumes some history or tradition of the grazing in the area.
Yeah.
We have another question in the chat from Lenka Reiterová. If I understand well, the recommendation is to count conservation management into strict protection. That means even in strictly protected areas, which are included in 1/3 strictly protected area, conservation management, or even the traditional farming, traditional economic use has to be possible under the condition of its necessity for saving biodiversity. And the question is it already the practice accepted by IUCN or just the recommendation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. No, it's not the practice which would be accepted by the IUCN. It is more a form of recommendation now in the European Commission discussions about the 10% strict protection. Of course, we have to be very careful with that. I think that we can only apply this to some very specific habitat types, or, as I said, ecosystems, let's say grasslands or some of the man-made water bodies, the small ponds or so on, where actually we need, I mean, there are traditional ponds, of course, and traditional grasslands, which are here for centuries, since the start of the European civilization, we could say. I mean, that they started with that. The problem is that this, of course, could not apply to other ecosystems, and for sure it will be a clash, and it will be a problem with the forestry lobby, because they would say, well, we also want to have some measures in the forests, but measures in the forest are not needed. Yeah, okay, if you need to cut one branch or a small tree which could fall on the walking path, or that's not a problem, but no large scale industrial logging, of course, is not compatible for that. And in principle, for the forest ecosystems, which are more or less still operating under some kind of natural regimes, we should only, there should be no discussion. Strict protection means no take zone. No, we should not discuss this. I'm only referring about this possible, let's say, explanation of the strict protection measures for the habitats and ecosystems which were man-made ecosystems for a long time, like grasslands.
Yeah, yeah. Lenka, thanks you for the answer. We are going quite deep to the topic, but I need to ask, in the case of forests, what about coppicing? It could be also, let's say, man-made habitat for a long time, and it's very precious somewhere. So,
yeah. That's also a very good question. Coppicing for me is not really a strict protection measure, for one thing, because I think that coppicing is more a measure that should be applied in a man-made landscapes. It's more how to say, it's not really a measure that would really support primarily conservation in the extent like the setting aside some grasslands that should be mowed once per year in the late summer or autumn for conservation. I think it's the difference because it's, how to say, coppicing is not really a measure that would really be needed to support survival of, let's say, of some specific species, while setting aside some grasslands for conservation is, if I manage to explain this.
Okay, thank you very much. There's no other question in the chat. So the last chance to ask anything. Okay, there's no other question. So thank you very much for the presentation and the answers. And thank you.
Thank you very much. I repeat again, I'm now looking at the list of names. I don't know much people here. Some of names I'm familiar with. I'm glad to see that there are new people coming, and that's really important that we start speaking the same language. And my message at the end would be: don't be ashamed as we used to be ashamed when expressing our let's say requests for conservation measures. It is not a crime to say that we want more and more effectively manage protected areas, because we are not doing this for our personal benefits, material benefits, probably for spiritual, yes, but not for material benefits. So please be strong, go ahead, don't be ashamed, and let's try to make our biodiversity work better. So thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure for me, and I wish you all success in your work, and hopefully we'll meet again in due time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrej.